Hey everybody, Tom Barnes, stories from the 78, and we've all dealt with grief in our own way, and it affects your body, it affects your relationships, and different kinds of grief have higher effects on you. And people have dealt with the loss of a child, what many would argue is the highest form of grief one can go through, depending on your situation. Now, all those are different, of course. But my friend here, Sally McQuillen, she went through the grief of losing her 21-year-old son. She has been brave and wrote a memoir about this grieving process, and I welcome her now to the stories from the 78. Sally, how are you?
I couldn't be better. I'm so glad to be joining you today, Tom, on a Friday afternoon, talking about anything Chicago oriented and of course being able to talk about my son Christopher is something I look forward to.
Well, absolutely, and thank you for taking time, of course, to hang out here with me. Before we get started into the book, just tell me a little bit about yourself. Before we got started here, you mentioned that you lived in the city in 1985. You were first year in the city, which is, if you're familiar with any sports in Chicago, one of the biggest years ever.
It was an incredible time to be living there and to be young and out of college and spending more than my fair share of time in the local bars and cheering for the Bears. And I just had this huge crush on Walter Payton and
Well,
had
who
a
didn't?
picture, honestly. And I remember listening to Gary Fensick on the radio,
Mhm.
and it was my first, it was like beginning to learn about football. I hadn't grown up following football before that. And now I've gone and married a man from Buffalo. So we
Oh,
are Buffalo Bills fans.
wait, you just decided you're going to be Buffalo Bills fan just because you married a guy?
You know what is really interesting? I kind of am this fair weather. I have to be, admittedly, I sort of lost my zest for the Bears
No.
after some time, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what the passion of being a really diehard fan looked like. But I found that out the hard way when my husband and I think we were just dating at the time, and he was having one of the, I think it was a Super Bowl party, and I should know better that the Buffalo Bills were, destined for loss. And
Uh,
he basically had me kicking all of our friends out. And I was like, "Are you serious? You couldn't be serious." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm serious. We're not gonna. I'm in mourning now." So, um,
yeah, three
and
in a row will
then
do that to you.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. So then my kids, my oldest Christopher, whom I did lose in 2016, 9 years ago, at the age of 21 in an accident, and he's the one that I write about in my memoir. He became also so much like his dad, and as did his young brother William, my now 25-year-old, became huge fans as well. And it's always a little bit painful, and I try not to be fair weather. I try to hang in there despite the heartbreak.
Well, I mean, that kind of goes with the territory of following your favorite sports teams if they're not the Yankees, Dodgers, or Chiefs these days, right? I
Apparently
mean,
so.
yeah.
Apparently so. Little did I know. Yes.
Before we wrap up, just a little intro Chicago part. I'm curious, where did you frequent when you were living in that area? Did you go down to like Russian Division? Was that big at that time?
It was. Rush
Mm.
Street was super big. And it's so strange. And this is just indicative of my age. I'm about to be 62, and I forgot what this bar that we spent a lot of time at right on Rush Street. I think it was off of Oak. It was right as you were sort of at the entrance of the magnificent mile.
Oh yeah. Mhm.
And we spent a lot of our time, like we would host our own parties there. We befriended, of course, the bartender and
Mhm.
the host, and um, just really enjoyed those crazy days. And I was working in public relations at that time, not too far from there. So that was where we spent our time, all of our
Yeah.
days.
Yeah, working in PR in the 80s in Chicago when the Bears were kings of this town, right out of college, that had to be a great time. And you mentioned PR, but you have since went on to get your master's, and you're a psychotherapist now in a private practice, specializing in addiction recovery. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so I worked in public relations and sports marketing, and then was actually hired to be a marketing person, a marketing rep at IBM, which may or may not have been the best fit for me as a young woman trying to sell technologies to, um, you know, big corporations.
Hmm.
But at that particular time, that was when I had gotten sober. So my life completely took a 180 turn. And as a result, and I actually loved the training that I received at IBM. It was sort of like its own little business school. And there was a lot of camaraderie, and it really sort of enabled me to kick off a different kind of a lifestyle, meeting completely new people. And then what I did was I was doing a lot of volunteer and service work, which caused me to reflect on what I wanted to do that might um, just be a better fit for me.
Hmm.
And so I got my master's degree in social work and got married and had my firstborn child. And at that point, was going to pursue being a therapist right out of the gate. And I'd been hired at a like a mental health sort of community center,
Hmm.
and I was really sick. I was like morning, noon, and night sick with my firstborn, so I had to postpone that. And then after Christopher was born, um, I realized I just, and he was colicky, and at the very beginning, um, needed more of me than, and it would have just, I probably would have lost money had I not been a full-time parent. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it just sort of turned into being the best decision to, and it was a privilege to be able to work, I should say, work and enjoy being a full-time mom for a little while.
Yeah, I'm in the throes of it again in my life. I have a 3-month-old at home here, so
Oh,
and thank you. I have
congratulations.
a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old, a little bit of a gap there, but yeah, we're doing it all over again. So
Oh, I love it when there's some pleasant surprises like that, or
yeah,
yeah,
it's been a
when
good.
life takes a refreshing turn and you get to do, oh, that's wonderful.
Yes, it's been a journey. Yeah, for sure. So you wrote your book comes out on April 1st, I believe. That's when it's the publishing date. Reaching for Beautiful, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And it's a memoir and a reflection of your son passing in a boating accident, but the backstory almost is, he was a kid that kind of craved danger. He battled addiction himself. Is that correct? And
That's right.
that
That's
and
right.
that and you mentioned that you got sober. So it's something that you've been dealing with for a long time in your family, but your son, from what I was reading about, was kind of kind of a hellion, right? Like he liked to go
Oh,
do all the things. So
absolutely.
you're trying to protect him from that, and then something tragic with a boat accident kind of takes his life there, and that's the epicenter of your entire memoir.
Yes, it's so the memoir kicks off in it immediately as you're reading about this accident during which he and three other boys are partying. They're 20 and 21 years of age, and they go to a lake house in Wisconsin and decide to get into a canoe, and none of them survive that decision to be out on a frozen lake. And so I wanted to be able to provide an inside look at grief,
Hmm.
the of over the loss of a child, because this is unfortunately so commonplace, and it could happen certainly via direct overdose. It could happen via an accident, via an illness, um, but we also have, more of a suicide and opioid epidemic. And so my heart goes out to all of the parents whom, like myself, have suffered such an unimaginable loss. And so part of me wanted to write about this to help them feel less alone, although that's sort of futile because grief is a pretty lonely path. But it was also to help other people who haven't lost, or maybe parents who've just simply raised a wild or different or neurodivergent child, feel less alone as well.
I imagine doing so was therapeutic for yourself to just put your be like I've talked to many authors over the years, and they all say consistently the same thing about you have to be vulnerable to have a story worth telling in a book, at least a book that publishers want to publish. So you did that with this book, you talk about your family addiction and how to stop that from carrying on, and your trials and tribulations, which is wrestling with that, and then of course the loss of your son and how it affected your family, yourself. I imagine. I mean, where do you even begin?
It began really as a means of communicating to Christopher. 21 days after he died, someone suggested that I write to him or write about him, and I began to write to him about how I was feeling and wanting, of course, so much just to have him. I'd always been on sort of a quest to ensure that he felt my love,
Hmm.
um, having grown up, not necessarily being on the receiving end of uh, like a tangible demonstration of love from one of my parents, my father, who was an alcoholic. So I really wanted to be able to be sure that, each of my three children, I've got two living children, could really feel it. Um, and so that got exacerbated when he died, and I just started, I mean, the first draft of my book would probably not be something that anyone would want to read because it would be pure love and loss, and
Hmm.
but I also wanted to capture all of my memories of what it was like to raise him before I forgot them.
Sure.
And so there was that as well that went into it. And then I realized that, one of the through lines was my own childhood as the daughter of an alcoholic, then in turn being a recovering alcoholic who's raising a child who's struggling with addiction.
How does one, stop that cycle? Is it impossible to stop because it's, genetics, or like what do you tell folks that come in there and be like, this has been going on in my family for as long as we can remember. How do I not have this happen to my kids?
Right. So it's so interesting because, you fast forward, I then become, I get my master's degree, I become a social worker, and I put that on hold. And then when my kids are getting older, I renew my license and begin to also get a specialization in addiction, even though I'm pretty sure I already feel pretty specialized in it. And but I get the education and
Is that
then
why
just,
though that you did that? Because of what you've dealt with?
it's sort of, yeah, it's not very unique. Many of us in the field of addiction end up trying to parlay our own personal experience to other people's benefit, but we're hoping, we've got to take care of ourselves really well to be able to do that.
Hmm.
And so what I learned slowly but surely, I remember when I first went to social work school, and at that time, right when we were probably even expecting Christopher, there was this sense of, oh, I've married a recovering alcoholic as well. What are the odds? How powerful are genes? Well, at that time, we didn't appreciate just how powerful a contributing factor genes could be. And certainly, if you look at my husband's ancestry in particular as an Irish um, child of 10 kids, the
Big family.
addiction is pervasive. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so um, together, I think I wrote I use the word combustible in my book, to get, it was sort of like an inevitability, but I had told myself I would just love them, all of my children, enough to offset, they wouldn't be raised in a traumatic environment. They would be well cared for. Um, and that maybe that would be enough. And truth be told, it's not necessarily enough. I pride myself now, retrospectively, in intervening in the way that we did to attempt to save Christopher's life. One of the ingredients that made addiction more combustible is the co-occurrence, which there always is in addiction, of some degree of depression, some degree of anxiety, and certainly attention deficit disorder. So all of these things, it's interesting. I was on the cusp of people learning more about them in the midst of it. So there wasn't a
Mm.
lot of, I think when I did get sober at the age of 25, people weren't entirely appreciating that the majority of those of us who do end up struggling with addiction usually have we're sensitive souls, and we usually are more inclined to have some depression and anxiety. So all
I
of that
didn't know that.
factors in. Did you know that? Yeah.
I
So
did
it's
not.
it's really interesting to start to see how there are a set of symptoms that tend to go hand in hand, to include in my son's part, his incredible impulsivity and his, just recklessness and wildness. So at 16, we were sending him away to be able to get sober, clean and sober already. And he, because we, had the means, and we also um, had the not, at least some of the knowledge, we we sent him away for a while, and we sacrificed our time, more time with him,
Hmm.
um, being a part of our family here. We certainly traveled to spend a lot of time with him. I wouldn't go more than 4 weeks at a time without visiting him, where he ended up in Arizona. But he did then have 3 years of sobriety preceding coming back to wanting to be normal and um, be like any other college kid. All of his peers were, from high school, were heading off, and he wanted to be able to do that too. So when he did, needless to say, he was back to participating in that lifestyle where everybody's abusing.
Yeah,
And
sure.
yeah, and so, my husband and I say we think he knew and planned, at some point to get resume his sobriety, but he also had this incredible chapter in college that was mostly fun, if not, exceedingly out of control.
I mean, that's got to be just such a like. There's not enough you can do, right? Like, there's always something like aside from chaining them to a bed, and like you got to let
Right.
people live. And I've had people in my life who have been victims of abuse, who like they go through things, and we'll talk about it in a second with grief. People handle grief differently, and grief does things to people that makes them at times unrecognizable to people who knew them prior to said grief, or if they're going through something, right? So like it's just it's just really hard to be a parent, and really hard to love somebody at times, and not like it's not hard to love somebody, but it's hard to love somebody that's going through something that you can't help them with, more than you already
I
are doing.
I can't emphasize that enough. That is one that's been one of my life lessons. That essentially, and I hope to impart that to parents as well. Most parents nowadays, we're all in fear, whether or not the stakes are as high as they were in my case. Um, but we operate from this place of fear, and that actually interferes with our ability to parent. Um, I think most, it sort of just like if I were still in my addiction and trying to parent, I couldn't be as emotionally available. Um, and if if a parent is in fear and that's driving them and they're so anxious about their child living their own life and following their own path and trying to spare them from any anguish or difficulty, then that relationship suffers and the child also does not benefit because there's this unintended message which is like, you can't do this.
Hmm.
I'm trying to make you do it better so that you're safe. And so I did thankfully appreciate that during Christopher's life, like before, the couple of years before he died and when he started to use again, it was like a really deliberate, conscious conditioning of a practice of trying to let go of fear. And I continued to use that and apply it to my relationship with my living children. So it's a tough one.
Yeah. How did that all affect your two other kids? When you guys are going through this as parents, they're going through it as siblings, and then dealing with the loss of that. I mean, I can't even imagine. Then also to then realize, you're completely gutted from that, but you still have two other kids and a husband and yourself to be there for, to muster up whatever energy you have to, you know, to be there for them and be strong. But I imagine you struggled with, this is just how it is today. I am not doing good versus I need to be strong, like, because people are from all walks of life where to show weakness, you can't show weakness for some families and some people. But I imagine you did a little bit of everything. I mean, how did that all affect you as a family when this stuff happened?
It devastated each and every one of us in different ways, and we all uh, loved and continue to love Christopher fiercely, but having a brother like him was not always easy for his younger siblings, and so that complicates matters because in some respects, um, when somebody does pass away, I mean, I actually am a little biased. I think of my son as a legend anyway in his own right. But then, once somebody passes, there's that little bit of extra legendary status. And it's sort
Hmm.
of like, well, wait a minute, say my daughter and my son, like he wasn't always so legendary, he could be, difficult. So,
Sure.
so there's that. I think all that I attempted to do during that time was to be as available, again, sort of driven by a desire to be present for whatever they were experiencing. I mean, part of it, just from a practical matter, was just um, even, you know, things like just trying to get my youngest to go to school. You know what I
Right.
mean? And it's so it's not, none of that stuff ends up being a part of this memoir because that's my living children's stories and they're,
Sure.
but I will say that one of the things that was helpful to my husband and I was to just respect each other in the way that we grieve. Because as you said earlier, people do grieve differently. So all I can do is share my own personal experience. I can say what, um, what I could have used or what I needed along the way. Like I could say, um, and I do say it, that I really appreciated it when people would show up and sit with me in that darkness.
Hmm.
But I also get that I was a walking representation of every mother's worst fear, and that it was not comfortable for many to um, to do that. At least not. Yeah, I don't want to give people a bad rap.
No, no,
I
no.
feel
I
like we
I
were
was gonna
so
say,
fortunate. You know what I mean? We were so fortunate. So many people showed up in such loving, beautiful, compassionate ways. Um,
but I imagine friends, it was probably awkward at best to talk to you about
Absolutely.
this because When you love somebody that is a friend and they go through something awful, it many ways is a reflection of what can happen to you, and a lot of people get scared with that, right? Like they're like, "Oh
That's
my
right.
gosh."
That's right.
So, when people get scared, they tend to, to hide, hide from things, like so you have those 2 types of friends, the friends that show up that are just there, and the friends that by not because they're not interested in being your friend anymore, but because what you're going through is too real for them. And they are
Yes.
people too, right? And I've learned that over the years where it's really easy to get mad at those people, right? And then you realize like that's not that you can't look at it through that way because that's their deal with this, and how they deal with trauma in their own way. And if you are a close friend of their, you hope that doesn't happen as somebody who's like your best friend or a relative, but it does because people are people, they're human beings and they all, react differently.
Right. There's so many different variations on this. Some people are really good at showing up initially, and then over time it fades out. And look, this is the one thing that I will say about, maybe it's unique to the loss of a child, but I will always be in grief. I will never not be. And so even now, 9 years later, if you, Tom, were to say to me, yeah, how's that? How are you feeling today? Or, um, tell me about Christopher, I'd be so down for that,
Hmm.
as opposed to um, just thinking in terms of the fact that you can't necessarily see it on my face. I'm not visibly crying. I also do that thing where I don't know that I necessarily mean to, but people think I've got it handled. It's my way of coping. They assume that I'm okay. So I think that was part of the risk of writing this is I'm really brutally vulnerable. I lay it out like this is an anguish like nothing I've ever felt before.
And I imagine that it also not tempted, maybe is not the right word, but it pushed you to the limits of your sobriety going through that kind of thing, right? I mean, I'm a person. I'm not a. I'm not recovering from anything in that way, but I would be pushed to the brink of just trauma and dealing with it. I mean, did that happen for you and your husband?
You know, I we were both traumatized in different ways, and interestingly enough, what felt like more of a solution to me was to consider not sticking it out.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't think that that's unusual when mother loses almost essentially a part of herself,
Sure. Yeah.
And so I was working like more deliberately on finding a way to continue to survive and be present for my living children. And I do think that having the work that I do be something that I could delve into in a more purposeful way that I know Christopher wants me to do
Hmm.
um, also kind of helped me get tethered in that way. I had a long foundation of sobriety. Certainly, I am sort of addictive through and through. So, did I gravitate to, eating more sugar and carbs than ever before? You better believe it. There are all those ways that we were kind of like looking for comfort.
Hmm.
And in some ways, I think it's appropriate early on to give yourself a tremendous amount of grace when it comes to, like do whatever you need to do. If you,
Right. You're not a robot.
exactly. If you can, I had friends that would say like, Sally, you got out of bed, so like that you're way ahead of the game.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that a period like that is imperative, and then ongoing to be really compassionate with yourself, because there's nothing I've ever known that feels harder.
You mentioned you look at your son now as a legend, the legend of the life that he lived. What stands out to you as legendary status of Christopher and a story of his?
He had an incredibly fun-loving spirit. He was pure and in the moment. I call him my wild horse. One of the things that to me is legendary, though, is his impact in his 21 years of life. I'm still learning about people that he knew and that are proud of having known him. He had a very, like both of his parents and his siblings, all of us have a certain degree of sensitivity. He really had this, particularly because of his attention deficit, because he struggled in school. He had such compassion for any underdog.
Mm.
Um, so he would do things like try to make, I remember when there were a couple of kids who were being teased for various reasons or bullied when they were young, and he would just make a point of, and Chris was, he didn't think that he was always cool. I thought he was, but certainly at the point when he'd achieved cool status in whatever those middle school years were, he did not participate in that bullying. He instead made a point of sort of calling out his relationship to people who were struggling or different.
That is
And
wonderful.
yeah, yeah,
And that is
love
part
that.
of the story that you write in Reaching for Beautiful, out April 1st. I imagine you're excited about it going out to the world to tell the story.
I really am. And the fact that it's coming out in April, Christopher was born in April, and it just feels it feels really good to me that I'm birthing it in this way, and that I'm just hoping it gets into the hands of people who will be comforted. I know it's not an easy read, but I do hope that they will be comforted and uplifted as they read how I survived.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just from what I've read already, it's that. So, thank you for bearing your soul and being vulnerable, as we talked about earlier. Where can people find the book, or where do you want them to go if they want to
They
go
can go
visit
to
somewhere?
any of their, they can go to their favorite local bookstores or Amazon or any place that books are sold, and they can pre-order it, and then it will be available to them as early as it's nearly 2 weeks from now.
And is there a site that, like, if you want people to go to that, maybe you have a book signing coming up of some kind or anything like that?
Absolutely. They can go to my website, www.sallymcquillen.com. McQuillen is spelled McQuillen.
Sally, thank you so much for taking time and sharing your story. I appreciate it.
Of course, Tom.